Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeologists to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and I'm joined with a distinguished-looking group of La Sierra faculty and administrators, and happy to do so. Larry Geraty, co-host of this program, and also co-director of the center, in charge of the advancement part. And you're doing very well at that, Larry. The center functions in large part because of your work.
Thanks to our loyal supporters.
That's right. We want to thank them. Among our viewers are some of our loyal supporters. So. And Dr. Warren Trenchard, who is in administration now, but you are a professor of New Testament and early Christianity, history of Christianity at La Sierra, and you kind of help graduate students find their way academically through the programs. So welcome to you, and you are our New Testament voice. We are all Old Testament types, but thank you for being that with us. And Dr. Bramlett, who is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity, also an associate director of the center, Archaeology Center. We have the privilege of thinking in this particular episode about actually two of the letters of Paul, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we do so again in the quest to find archaeological connections that might actually illuminate our understanding of the letter. I've often said that if I could be in the place of one of the audience members listening to this letter, I think I'd be in vantage ground to know something, to hear something, to catch nuances that now, removed by 2,000 years, it's pretty hard to do. So archaeology is one of the tools we use to get there and to discover something more. We've got these two letters to think about. Any initial reactions to the Corinthian correspondence? I'm using a scholarly term now, okay. That's for your benefit, Warren, okay. So any initial reactions? Are these books that you turn to often? Are they, do they give you the kind of devotional lift that you look for when you're reading Scripture?
They deal with everyday problems that even exist now, not only in Corinth, and so they're interesting for that reason. You mentioned the Corinthian correspondence. There are actually other letters that Paul wrote to Corinth that we wish we had. There's one that purported to be his that we're not sure about, and then there are others that are lost to history, right?
4? Is 4 the number that scholars float?
Well, first of all, we have some reference in these letters that are in the New Testament to other letters. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul refers to the letter that I wrote to you. And then in chapter 7, he refers to the questions you sent to me in a letter. So we know then that there was at least an exchange of correspondence between Paul and these Corinthian Christians prior to his writing of 1 Corinthians. Some scholars feel that maybe that first of Paul's letters might now be 2 Corinthians. I don't happen to have that view of the matter, and I think I won't argue the case here, but it seems to me that this is simply a letter of Paul's that we no longer have. And we have some reference to Paul talking about writing his letter to the Laodiceans, for example, and asking the believers in Colossae to get a hold of that and share the letter that he wrote to Colossae and so forth. So the idea that there were letters written by some of these New Testament writers that we no longer have should not be particularly troubling to us. So I think Paul wrote the believers there a letter. What stimulated that apparently was a group of Christians from Corinth who had come across the water to Ephesus, across the Aegean, and they had brought Paul a report of some of the problems in the church, notably problems of disunity over a variety of things. And so he seems then to have written them a letter to address this. In response to this, they wrote back to him. Chapter 7 is an indication of that. And they had a series of questions. And he starts out that chapter by saying, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." And then he proceeds for several chapters to answer questions about the role and function of marriage, sexuality within marriage, and so forth. Issues concerning how people should eat with reference to the local marketplace and so forth, how they should conduct themselves vis-a-vis the Lord's Supper and so on. So he's addressing a number of things. And then when we get into, and towards the end of that, what we call 1 Corinthians, which is probably, I call letter B, there was a letter A, now this is letter B, he's talking about visiting them. He has had a foundational visit on his first mission trip. He is going to visit them again. And when we pick up 2 Corinthians, he has clearly visited them, that visit that he had anticipated.
It's already taken place.
So there's a visit, there's a letter from him, there's a letter from them. 1 Corinthians comes, there's anticipation of another visit. He has that visit. And then in 2 Corinthians, he says, I wrote back to you, and I'm very sorry for the tone that I had. And that doesn't really sound like anything that we have from him. So I think that's another lost letter.
Good context.
Which probably was lost because it wasn't particularly flattering to either Paul or the readers.
Intentionally gotten lost
Right.
somehow.
So then he writes he wrote to them what we now call 2 Corinthians, and he has in there some anticipation of another visit.
Right.
Putting that together, I think we have 5 pieces of correspondence, one from the Corinthians to Paul, 4 letters from Paul to them, and 3 visits scattered in between.
Okay. Kent, thoughts about Corinthians, either of the books, or both?
Well, just altogether, the connection with Corinth is very fascinating because it's a great city where we can make some of those rare connections with actual places where Paul stood or near which he functioned. And there's only a handful of places. Maybe Ephesus would be another. We may, probably not that close in Rome, but we may get close to that.
Right.
And of course, Jerusalem and Galilee.
And even some artifacts. And that reminds me, we do have some artifacts on the table in front of us, pulled together by Christina Reed at the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. We thank her. What do we have on your end of the table?
Well, we have another example of a head. This one is not marble. This one is terracotta or ceramic. That would be a less expensive, less labor-intensive way to produce a resemblance of an individual. The ears are even different heights here, so this was not a highly skilled artisan that produced this. But again, very important in the Roman world, these physical representations of family members for funerary contexts or for recognition where the individual is an important person in the city.
Right.
We have, again, examples of written material, a stone fragment, a brick. These are much more common in Roman times than they were in earlier times. We see this progression of the availability and widespread, even literacy to some extent among the populace.
With the 2 main languages of the Roman world.
Yes, Greek and Roman. And moving on to glass. Again, this is something that's fun to follow because we have specific schools or regions which produce glass, and there were some trade secrets, and they were very careful to protect those. They could produce special kinds of glass outside of the usual trade vessels like we see here for perfumes and for makeup of different kinds. But again, we can trace then some of the arts, how the arts develop within the Roman world through these artifacts.
Okay. Larry, what do we have coming your direction?
Well, these are vessels that are ceramic, and these, of course, are glass. And you can see they were perhaps used for similar purposes, but through 2 different media. Here you have lamps, which are typical of the Roman period, small clay lamps with filler holes for oil, and the wick would go there. Here we have 2 larger ceramic vessels that are decorated in a very typical way for the period. And I think you probably want to talk about the mirrors.
Well, talking about the correspondence, the Corinthian correspondence, we do read in 1 Corinthians 13 about seeing
through a glass.
Is it through a glass, or is it seeing in a mirror
glass.
in a glass? And these are bronze, of course. The one on the right being a compact We're not so fancy. We shouldn't claim to have invented the compacts. The Romans did that a long time ago. And then we have the mirrors, which when polished gave a fairly good image, a good reflection. So
right, we use silver today for the backing of mirrors. Copper or bronze is probably next best.
Right. So, well, then let's take a look at some slides to think about the book in its context and some artifacts and some locations and architecture, so all kinds of things archaeological. We'll look again at the empire and at the city of Corinth itself. Kent, you've talked about this, but we're talking basically about expansion. If we think of preceding empires to the west, we're going to the west.
Think about the centrality of Greece to this, not only geographically, but culturally.
Right. And then a couple of slides. Kent, talk about these. Corinth has been identified with a little yellow box over on the left-hand side. This is the second missionary journey, then we'll look at the third.
Right, it makes an interesting wandering path across Asia Minor. Turkey in those days, what's now Turkey, was this interesting patchwork of different languages, native languages, and regions that are now completely lost to us, but the names crop up. And of course, then Corinth in the west there had long trade relations between east and west because this was a shortcut trade route, sort of like the Panama Canal, where you could go overland, crossing the isthmus, and connect Italy with the east there and the markets.
Okay, then we look at the third missionary journey, and this is the one we talked about Romans before, probably written on this missionary journey. Would that be right, Warren?
Likely.
Most likely. And again, Corinth included here. Take us downtown, Kent.
Well, Corinth had been destroyed when the Romans conquered Greece, totally devastated, but then rebuilt. So by the 1st century, Paul's time, it was a thriving, fairly new city, one of the largest in the Roman Empire, second tier after the three biggest first-tier cities, Rome, Alexandria, and Ephesus, but very substantial. And notice that you have a forum, that's simply the Latin for agora, which is Greek for market, and the bema, which is simply Greek again for rostrum in Latin, a podium. And this is where public dignitaries could address a crowd for certain purposes. That will
pop up.
Will pop up
in Corinthians.
Exactly. We have a theater, of course, Odeon, which is a small theater-style structure, and two of several temples. The Temple of Apollo is still partially visible in the ruins. And there's an important road that runs down to the port.
How do you pronounce that?
I pronounce it Lycaon.
Lycaon Road. And that does show up in the book of Acts. We hear about that. And the connections. Now, the bema, or where's the accent on that? Is it bema or bema? I'm asking the Greek scholars over here.
I would say bema.
We've all taught Greek, haven't we?
We have.
we should know the answer. I have taught Greek, so I should know the answer. That's going to be important because of one character by the name of Gallio, the proconsul, or is the proconsul of Achaia? Is that what he is, or?
He's sort of Gallio is the proconsul of the region, yeah, of which Corinth is in one corner.
Right, and he encounters Paul at the
Bema.
Bema. I'm going with your pronunciation. Okay. So, well, then let's think about the book itself. Okay, a little bit of chronology. We have the Roman emperors here. Mostly we're talking Claudius and Nero at the bottom of this list, if we want to set it. A few comments, some brief comments, Warren, about the basic questions that scholars ask when they approach a new book.
Well, what you have here are issues that are very important in helping one read with intelligence an ancient document. And the pieces of the New Testament require the same kind of understanding. We can't answer precisely all of these questions, and probably to some extent none of them to our satisfaction. We get some idea of dates based on things we find in the text, the authorship, that kind of thing is dependent on style and ideas and so forth that we can establish from elsewhere. The audience is pretty much the, what were the characteristics of the original readers, and so forth. I mean, these are all very important issues when one approaches a piece of the Bible.
And you're okay with our assertion that archaeology at least helps us get at answers to some of these?
Absolutely. It helps with the background issues and background and historical and architectural context, and sometimes the religious context as you find evidence of local religious activities.
I think we should let Warren stay. I think he's proven himself. His, well, your experience in archaeology, but also a sensitivity to it throughout your studies. In what we can learn from
archaeology
it.
can even help us with understanding the Greek words, because one little village I was digging in, I found a 3rd century BC home of an individual who had his ostraca, broken pieces of pottery with writing on it, in his room. And one of them indicated that he called himself a kapelos, which is a Greek word, which is found in the New Testament only in 2 Corinthians, the last verse of chapter 2, 2 Corinthians, where Paul says that he is not a kapelos. He's not a peddler of God's word, but he's trying to follow God's counsel and has given his life to it. So here I found the home of an individual who said he was a kapelos. He was a peddler, and that's the way he earned his living. So it helps to provide a picture for what Paul said he wasn't.
Right, oh, good. It's reverse, but
It's
that's
reverse.
okay.
And just before that, in that same chapter in 2 Corinthians, there is a reference to something we were talking about recently, namely a triumphal entry into a city. Mm-hmm. And we saw the evidence of the Arch of Titus with the depiction of spoils brought back from the conquering of the Jews in Palestine and the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem and so forth. That was part of a triumphal march, a triumphal entry into the city. Oftentimes they would bring some representatives of the captives who came in as slaves, along with artifacts that they had brought back. And so Paul is using this kind of language in that same chapter of saying, well, we are part of, because not only did they bring slaves and so on back, but the military people themselves who had done the conquering shared in the victory by being part of the parade. Paul says, we are sharing in Christ's triumphal march.
Those are terrific insights as we think about trying to understand these books written 2,000 years ago. Now, the outline, we have a couple of slides here for 1 Corinthians, and it's not that we can spend, again, a lot of time, but maybe a general feel for the flow here. It's not like Romans. You don't have quite the same development, but it does seem to me that you get to a place of trying to bring people together. There seems to be that. Maybe that's a common theme in all of Paul's letters, or at least in most of them.
And Paul,
I think 1 Corinthians is probably not well known for these reasons that I'm going to mention in a second. We tend to think of the great chapters on love and the great chapter on the resurrection of Jesus and resurrection from the dead in general as being theological, ethical, and so on. But above all, 1 Corinthians in particular is one of the greatest pastoral letters that we have from Paul. This back and forth with this congregation, interacting with their concerns, his concerns about them, and so forth. It is a pastoral masterpiece.
And we probably will learn more from the book if we think of it more in those terms than just theological questions we have. In fact, probably with all of Paul's letters, we should pay attention. So we then have another part of the first letter to the Corinthians, where we do get to the famous places like the fruit and the gifts and of the Spirit and the love chapter and so on. And then 2 Corinthians, a little less complicated or complex. You want to say something about this, Warren, about the flow here?
Well, scholars tend to focus on particular issues with regard to these various documents. This one presents us with the challenge of what we call integrity. Was it written in the form that we have it now by Paul. There's a fairly general agreement that Paul wrote this, but because of the fragmentation and the splitting of this Paul defending himself in those first 7 chapters against his critics throughout the Christian world at the time, but particularly in Corinth, and then returning to that with a vengeance, actually, and some really exaggerated and exasperated kind of comments in chapters 10 through 13, with this interlude in between talking about his desire that these people in Corinth, these Christians, participate in his collection of funds for, quote, the saints in Jerusalem. He wants to go back not only as one who has brought the gospel to the Mediterranean world, but he was going back to Jerusalem. He knew he was going back as a controversial figure. Mm-hmm. And so he wanted to show his solidarity with Christians there by collecting this offering for them. How do we explain the separation of this defense on his part by this focus on the collection? And we don't necessarily need to solve that here today, but that is one of the main issues when it comes to examining the challenges of reading 2 Corinthians.
Okay. Well, then let's think about some archaeological connections that we might see that would connect with the book. We do have a number of indications of the immorality. We have temples and we have practices. We have historians who talk about what is going on in Corinth.
And the people in the church there were not exempt from some of these issues, were they?
Right.
So Paul is helping them deal with it.
Correct. And then we have some sports. I mean, Paul uses sports imagery to that was all around him. It was part of the air he breathed, because this was one of the 4 cities where the Pan-Hellenic Games were held. So he was picking up with what people were familiar with.
And Doug, you mentioned some of these problems that the people, the Christians in Corinth had, that he's writing about, and he's counseling them concerning. What is, I think, one of the greatest pieces of good news to modern readers, for modern readers of this text, is that at the very beginning, Paul addresses these people as saints.
Let's remember that.
That is a great piece of good news to me.
It is. Good point. And we have some other sorts of issues. The Corinthian correspondence has a lot of issues that connect. And Kent, as you said, Corinth lends itself to these archaeological connections. And so a number of these, we won't look at all of them, but we will take a look at some. What is the Acro-Corinth?
Well, a lot of these cities had a raised area, an Acropolis, like in Athens, we know quite well. And at Corinth, it was called the Acro-Corinth, acro meaning high. It had a succession of temples on top. Most of the ruins we see here are later from, the time of really the Venetian control of the area, and the Ottoman Turks and so forth. But there are still remnants of some of the earlier Roman period temples.
Much higher than the city itself.
So you're looking down, Corinth,
and we'll see it from the other side too.
in the low part
So
of that
what
photo.
was the line, and who was the historian who talked about the prostitutes that came down from the 1,000 prostitutes each night that came down from the higher part of Corinth, the Acro-Corinth? I've forgotten the historian's name, but we do have that as kind of fleshing out, I didn't mean to put it quite that way, but at least giving this background to help us, and to help us make sense of Paul's epistle too. So. Aphrodite, a positive influence?
Well, this was the famous temple, and of course scholars do debate how and in what way the prostitution was associated with the temple, perhaps as sort of a fundraiser. Probably not in the temple, most modern scholars would say, but associated as part of an endowment of the temple.
The games. Let the games begin. So
you mentioned the various other cities that were involved.
That's
in the
correct.
games there.
While Athens and Isthmia are listed here, they're not listed according to the sites that the 4 major sites were the games, but they include Corinth. And so Paul would have been acquainted very well with these games and drew some of his metaphors. So when we read in this letter or others about sports metaphors, he was living with them, and people would have quickly picked up on them. Larry, you like this picture.
I do, because when you visit the museum there, you have all these body parts that are hanging on the wall and exhibited. And they came that way because they were votive offerings that were taken to the temple by people who had these problems and were hoping that by leaving these things at the temple that they would be healed, that body part would be healed. And so when you see this as a background to 1 Corinthians 12, is it, where the body parts are mentioned, then it all comes to make sense.
And you wouldn't leave them hanging on a wall like this. You'd want to put them together into a human being, which is part of his support for unity. His message on unity. So that's an intriguing collection. Okay, some more architecture and artifacts. We've looked at this before, but it may be one of the earliest architectural illustrations of these house churches. This one, of course, in the north of Israel, but to the east of where we are here. Now you can see the Acrocorinth and how high it is, and the Apollo Temple. Kent.
Roman mirrors. There we have, well, it's a complete one with the handle attached to the disc of the mirror. And then on the right, a compact again. It folds open. It's a very portable version.
Right.
And we talked about those very two objects here.
Right. And the connections with 1 Corinthians 13, the glass. Inscriptions. We do need to think about some inscriptions. We're not going to read this, but it mentions Gallio, who is the proconsul, and he is meeting Paul at the Bema. And so this is what it talks about. And here is an inscription from Delphi that mentions, so Delphi is a long ways away, but he had a large territory. So we have Gallio mentioned. And then Erastus, who was in Corinth, and he's mentioned in the book of Romans because Paul is passing greetings on from Erastus. So we have his, and we have his inscription here.
Which can be seen today in that inscription.
If you can find it, it's kind of out there, and you just have to go looking for it. The person who followed Erastus as treasurer of the city, his name is Babius. And then some other locations. I want to go to the Agora, and I want to put this here because we hear about clanging cymbals. They have been, there have been metal shops found in the Agora and in the region of the city of Corinth. So these connections would have been very quick and easy to make. And then the road you talked about, I think, Kent. And then the Bema. So when you stand there and you're on the platform or you're on the pavement in front of this, you're thinking of Paul standing there. And Gallio's response to Paul is what?
This is a religious dispute. Nothing of importance for the state.
Let's not worry too much about it. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Warren and Kent. And all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.